He was a man carved from the granite of the unforgiving mountains he called home, a ghost who haunted the edges of civilization, his past a collection of scars, both seen and unseen. She was a widow, a woman of gentle birth cast into the harsh dust of the frontier, her name disgraced and her future held hostage by a ruthless cattle baron who saw her not as a person, but as a final, desirable piece of a conquered map. When Silas Blackwood looked at Alara Vance and her infant son, he saw only property. He gave her an ultimatum, a cruel vow whispered in the cloying dust of Redemption Gulch, that her land would be his, her body would be his, and by the first snows of winter she would be carrying his child. But Blackwood failed to account for the mountain man, the silent watcher named Caleb Stone, who saw not property, but a flicker of defiance in a woman's eyes that reminded him of a fire he thought had long been extinguished in his own soul. His intervention would be as sudden and inexplicable as a summer storm, an act that would chain his fate to hers and set them both on a collision course with a man who believed the entire world was his for the taking. The wind was a constant thief in this high, lonely valley. It stole the warmth from a man's bones and the hope from a woman's heart. Alara Vance felt it scour the small porch of her cabin, pulling at the frayed edges of her shawl and whispering lies of a winter that would break her. She held her son Samuel closer, his small, warm weight, a fragile anchor in a world trying to sweep her away. It had been 6 months since her husband, Thomas, had been found at the bottom of Miller's Ravine, his horse gone lame, his neck broken. 6 months of the town of Redemption Gulch, looking at her with a mixture of pity and suspicion. Thomas had been a dreamer, a man who had seen a paradise in this patch of unforgiving land, ignoring the fact that it bordered the vast, ever-expanding empire of Silas Blackwood. Alara had known nothing of the debts, not until Blackwood himself had ridden up to her door, his large frame blocking out the sun, his smile a tight, predatory slash in his sun-weathered face. He had produced the papers, a stack of promissory notes bearing Thomas's increasingly desperate signature. The debt was staggering, insurmountable. The land is security, of course, Blackwood had said, his eyes not on the papers but roaming over her, making her feel as though the wind had stripped her bare. A pretty piece of land. That spring of yours is a rare thing in these parts. She knew the spring was the true prize. It was a deep, reliable source of water that never ran dry, even in the hottest summers. For a cattle baron like Blackwood, it was worth more than gold. It was the key to controlling the entire valley. He had made his offer then. It was not an offer of mercy, but of ownership. You're a woman alone, Mistress Vance. It's not a position of strength, but I am a generous man. His gaze had dropped to the swell of her chest, then to the bundle in her arms. Marry me. The debt is forgiven. Your son will have a father, a powerful father. The words had hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Ilara had felt a cold dread that had nothing to do with the wind. She saw her future in his eyes, a gilded cage, another possession to be displayed and used. She had refused, quietly but with a firmness that surprised even herself. I will find a way to honor my husband's debt, Mr. Blackwood. His smile vanished. It was as if a mask had slipped, revealing the raw, brutal ambition beneath. He leaned forward in his saddle, his voice dropping to a low, venomous growl. You have until the end of the month, then the deed reverts to me, as will everything on it. He paused, letting the threat settle. Make no mistake, Ilara. One way or another you will warm my bed, and by winter you'll carry my son. The memory of that vow was a brand on her mind. Now, standing on her porch with Samuel sleeping in her arms, she knew the end of the month was only 2 days away. Hope was a currency she no longer possessed. She looked toward the jagged peaks of the Dragoon Mountains, their stone faces indifferent and ancient. It was said a man lived up there, a recluse, a ghost. Some said he was a deserter, others a madman who had lost his family. They called him Stone. It was a fitting name for a man who chose to live among the rocks, far from the grasping hands of men like Silas Blackwood. Her gaze fell back to her own small patch of earth, the vegetable garden wilting, the single milk cow lowing softly in the lean-to, the grave marker under the lone cottonwood. This was all she had left of Thomas's dream, and soon it would be gone. The next day, she hitched her weary horse to the buckboard and made the long, dusty trip into Redemption Gulch. There was one last chance, a fool's hope. She carried a small, velvet-lined box containing her mother's jewelry, the last vestiges of her former life as a banker's daughter in a civilized city back east. It would not be enough to clear the debt, but perhaps it would be enough to buy a little more time. Redemption Gulch was Blackwood's town. His brand, the Double B, was on the flank of every third horse tied to the hitching post. His name was on the saloon, the hotel, the mercantile. The people who walked the dusty street did so with their heads slightly bowed, as if feeling the weight of his dominion. As Alara stepped into the mercantile, the low hum of conversation died. Eyes slid toward her, filled with the town's collective, fearful knowledge of her predicament. She ignored them, walking directly to the counter where Mr. Abernathy, a man whose spine seemed to have been surgically removed, was polishing the brass weights of his scale. Mr. Abernathy, she began, her voice steady, I need to send a wire, and I was hoping you might be interested in purchasing these. She opened the box. The pearls and gold filigree seemed alien in the dim, utilitarian space. Abernathy's eyes widened, then flickered nervously toward the door. Mistress Vance, I can't. Of course you can, a smooth, deep voice said from behind her. Silas Blackwood filled the doorway, flanked by two of his hired men, their hands resting near their holstered pistols. He sauntered in, the jingle of his spurs the only sound in the silent store. He stopped beside her, his scent of leather and cheap cigar smoke turning her stomach. She's selling off the family jewels, Blackwood announced to the room. A noble effort, but futile. He picked up a delicate necklace, letting the pearls slide through his thick, calloused fingers. This is lovely, but it won't even cover the interest. He turned to face her, his proximity an act of aggression. The time is up, Alara. The town is here to bear witness. The debt is called. The land is mine. Abernathy wrung his hands, refusing to meet her gaze. The other patrons, a rancher's wife, two prospectors, shrank back, melting into the shadows. There would be no help here. She was utterly alone. It is a private matter, Mr. Blackwood, she said, her chin high. It stopped being private when your husband signed his name, he retorted, his voice booming. But I'm a reasonable man. I'll make you one final public offer. I'll take these trinkets as a down payment. The rest, you can work off, at my ranch, as my wife. A collective gasp went through the room. It was a proposal of absolute humiliation, a public branding. Ilara felt the blood drain from her face. This was it. The end. The moment of her complete and total defeat. And then the front door creaked open again. The man who entered was not a man of the town. He was a piece of the wilderness itself, come down from the high peaks. He stood at least 6'4", with shoulders that strained the seams of his hide jacket. His hair was long and dark, his face a hard mask of sun-browned skin and angles, bisected by a faint, white scar that ran from his temple to his jaw. He moved with a silence that was unnerving, his moccasined feet making no sound on the wooden floorboards. His was the mountain ghost, Caleb Stone. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, swept the room once, taking in every detail before settling on the scene at the counter. They held no warmth, no judgment, only a deep, still watchfulness like a wolf assessing a threat. Blackwood, momentarily thrown by the interruption, puffed out his chest. We're conducting business here, Stone. Go back to whatever rock you crawled out from under. Caleb Stone did not look at Blackwood. His gaze remained on the counter, on the pearls in Blackwood's hand, and on the pale, defiant face of the woman standing beside him. He took 2 silent steps forward, his presence sucking the air from the room. He reached into a leather pouch at his belt and pulled out a small, heavy deerskin bag. He didn't open it. He simply dropped it onto the counter. It landed with a solid, definitive thud that echoed in the silence. The sound of real weight, the sound of power that owed nothing to signed papers or public opinion. What's the debt? His voice was a low rumble, like stones shifting deep underground. It was the first time Alara had ever heard it. Blackwood stared at the bag, then at Caleb, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. That's none of your concern. Caleb's gaze finally shifted to Blackwood. It was a flat, chillingly empty stare. What's the debt? It was not a question. It was a demand forged of iron. Abernathy, seeing a chance to be useful, scurried to his ledger. He licked his finger, flipped a few pages, and stammered, with interest. It's it's $472, Mr. Blackwood. Caleb nudged the deerskin bag toward the trembling shopkeeper. Count it. Abernathy fumbled with the drawstring and poured the contents onto the counter. It was not coin. It was raw gold. Dozens of rough, gleaming nuggets panned from some secret mountain stream. The entire store seemed to hold its breath as Abernathy began to weigh them, his hands shaking. Blackwood watched, his face darkening to a thunderous shade of red. This was not part of his plan. This silent, savage giant was derailing his public victory, stealing his power with a bag of rocks. Stone, this is between me and the woman. You have no part in it. Caleb ignored him, his attention fixed on the scales. After a long, tense minute, Abernathy looked up, his eyes wide. It's it's over $500 worth, sir. Good, Caleb rumbled. He looked at Blackwood. The debt is paid. Give her the papers. I don't have to do a damn thing. Blackwood snarled, his hand drifting toward his pistol. His two henchmen tensed, their knuckles white. Caleb moved. It was not fast, but it was with a terrifying finality. He took one step, and his large hand closed around Blackwood's wrist, the one still holding the pearls. Blackwood grunted in pain, his fingers involuntarily opening. The necklace clattered to the floor. The papers, Caleb repeated, his voice unchanged, but the pressure in his grip must have been immense. A faint cracking sound was audible in the still room. Blackwood's face went pale. All right, he choked out. He nodded curtly to one of his men, who quickly produced the stack of promissory notes from an inner pocket. The man threw them onto the counter as if they were cursed. Caleb released Blackwood's wrist. He then swept the gold nuggets back into their pouch, leaving only the exact amount on the scale. He picked up the promissory notes, tore them in half, then in half again, and let the pieces flutter to the floor. He then scooped up the necklace and placed it gently back in its velvet box, closing the lid. He pushed the box toward Alara. His gaze met hers for a fraction of a second. There was nothing there she could read. No kindness, no pity, no explanation. Just a vast, empty wilderness. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the mercantile. The door swung shut behind him, leaving a room full of stunned silence, a humiliated cattle baron, nursing his wrist, and a woman who had just been saved by a ghost. Her debt to Blackwood was gone, but she felt with a terrifying certainty that she had just incurred a new one, to a man far more dangerous and inscrutable. Alara gathered her things, her hands trembling so badly she could barely close the jewelry box. She could feel Blackwood's murderous glare on her back as she hurried out of the store. She half expected a bullet, but all that followed her was his enraged, impotent silence. Outside, the sun was blinding. Her buckboard was where she had left it, but another horse was tied nearby, a massive gray stallion that could only belong to one man. Caleb Stone was leaning against the side of the building, arms crossed over his chest, waiting. He looked like a statue carved from the mountainside. He pushed off the wall as she approached. Get in your wagon. She hesitated, clutching the box to her chest. Why? Why did you do that? He didn't answer. His gaze swept the street, noting the faces peering from windows, the way Blackwood's men had followed them out and were now watching from the saloon doors. He'll send his men after you. You won't make it back to your cabin alone. It was a statement of fact, not an offer of help. He was not asking her permission. He untied his stallion, swinging into the saddle with an easy grace that belied his size. I don't have the money to repay you, she said, the words feeling small and useless. That was a fortune in gold. His eyes, cold as river water, met hers. I didn't ask for your money. He nudged his horse forward. Let's go. There was no arguing with him. The set of his jaw was as final as a landslide. Alara climbed into the buckboard, her mind reeling. She clucked to her old horse, and the wagon lurched forward. Caleb Stone fell in behind her, his large frame a silent, intimidating shadow that followed her out of town. The journey back to her homestead was made in near total silence. The only sounds were the creak of the wagon wheels, the plodding of the horses, and the ever present wind. Caleb rode a dozen paces back, a sentinel whose purpose was a mystery. He was not protecting her out of kindness, she thought. Men like him did not act on such sentiments. It was something else, a code she couldn't decipher, or perhaps he had simply bought himself a problem and was now seeing it through. As they cleared the last rise and her small, vulnerable cabin came into view, the sky to the west had turned a bruised purple. The wind had picked up, carrying the sharp, cold scent of imminent rain, or worse. A late autumn storm was rolling in off the dragoons, fast and violent. Caleb urged his horse forward, riding up beside her. Get inside, unhitch your horse, and get it in the lean-to. It was a command, not a suggestion. As she pulled the wagon to a halt, the first drops of icy rain began to fall. She fumbled with the harness, her fingers clumsy with cold and anxiety. He dismounted and, in a few swift, efficient movements, had her horse unhitched and lead into the small shelter next to the milk cow. He did the same with his own stallion, which dwarfed her small mare. By the time they were both on the porch, the rain was coming down in hard, slanting sheets, turning the dusty yard to mud. The temperature had dropped 10 degrees in as many minutes. Alara pushed open the cabin door, a wave of guilt washing over her. She was bringing this force of nature into her home, into Samuel's space, but leaving him outside in this storm was unthinkable. Come in, she said, her voice barely a whisper against the rising howl of the wind. He stepped inside, ducking his head to clear the low door frame. He filled the small room, his presence immense and overwhelming. He brought the scent of pine, wet leather, and cold stone with him. Samuel, startled by the noise, began to cry from his cradle near the hearth. Ilara rushed to him, lifting him into her arms and murmuring soft reassurances. Caleb stood by the door, perfectly still, his eyes taking in the single room, the small bed in one corner, the rough-hewn table, the stone fireplace where the embers glowed faintly. It was a sparse, clean space, a woman's desperate attempt to hold back the wilderness at her door. And now the wilderness was inside. He looked at the child in her arms. For a moment, the hard mask on his face seemed to soften, a flicker of some ancient, buried pain in his eyes. It was there and gone so quickly she thought she might have imagined it. Woodpile's low, he stated, his gaze moving to the small stack of logs by the hearth. He shed his wet hide jacket, revealing the broad expanse of his back and shoulders, covered in a simple flannel shirt. He did not seem to feel the cold. I'll bring more in. Before she could protest, he was back out the door, disappearing into the maelstrom. Alara held Samuel close, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The storm outside was nothing compared to the one that had just walked into her life. Caleb Stone had paid her debt, shielded her from Blackwood, and was now chopping wood in her yard as if he belonged there. She was no longer Blackwood's property, but she had no idea what she was to this man. He returned minutes later, his arms laden with perfectly split logs, his hair and shirt soaked through. He stacked the wood neatly by the hearth without a word, then took the poker and stirred the embers, expertly rebuilding the fire until it blazed to life, casting dancing shadows on the walls. The storm settled in for a long siege. The rain turned to sleet, rattling against the single window pane like a handful of thrown pebbles. The wind shrieked around the corners of the cabin. There was no question of him leaving tonight. They were trapped, together. The silence between them was a heavy, breathing thing. Ilara busied herself with Samuel, changing and feeding him. She was intensely aware of Caleb's every movement. He sat at the small table, cleaning his hunting knife with a piece of oilcloth he produced from his satchel. His hands were huge, scarred and calloused, but they moved with a surgeon's precision. She felt a desperate need to fill the quiet, to try and understand the man who now held her fate in his hands. "There's stew," she offered, her voice sounding thin. "It's not much." He looked up, his expression unreadable. "Thank you." She ladled the thin rabbit stew into two bowls and placed one in front of him with a piece of hard bread. He ate with the same quiet efficiency he did everything else, his eyes never leaving his bowl. He was like a great, patient predator, conserving his energy, his senses alert. After they ate, she put a sleeping Samuel back in his cradle. The fire crackled, the wind howled, and the silence returned, thicker than before. Ilara sat on the edge of her bed, her hands clasped in her lap. She had to know. "Why?" she asked again, this time her voice stronger. "No one has ever stood up to Silas Blackwood. You did it for a stranger." Caleb finished wiping his knife and slid it back into its sheath. He looked not at her, but into the flames of the fire. His profile was all hard lines and shadows. "I don't like bullies," he said, the words low and rough. It was an answer, but it explained nothing. Plenty of people didn't like Blackwood. They just feared him more. "That was more than a year's wages for most men," she pressed. "That gold." "The mountain provides," he said simply, cutting off the line of questioning. He leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking in protest. He seemed to settle in, his gaze fixed on the fire, his thoughts 1,000 miles away, in a place she could never reach. Ilara watched him, a slow, dawning realization taking hold. He wasn't a madman. He wasn't a simple savage. There was a deep, unassailable stillness to him, a core of solid rock that could not be shaken by men like Blackwood. He operated by his own laws, forged in solitude and hardship. By paying her debt, he had not bought her. He had drawn a line in the dust. He had claimed the conflict as his own. The night wore on. Ilara, exhausted, eventually lay down on her bed, pulling a thin blanket over herself. She didn't undress. She couldn't bring herself to be that vulnerable, not with this stranger in her house. She lay there, listening to the storm and the steady breathing of the man in the chair. She expected to lie awake all night, but a profound weariness took her, and she fell into a deep, dreamless sleep for the first time in months. She felt safe. It was a terrifying and wonderful sensation. She woke to the smell of coffee. The storm had passed, and pale morning light filtered through the window. The fire was burning brightly, and Caleb was standing by it, pouring coffee from a small pot into a tin cup. He had not slept in her bed. It looked like he had not slept at all, but had kept watch from the chair all night. He heard her stir and turned. He gestured with the pot. "There's more." She sat up, her hair a mess, feeling exposed. She nodded mutely and pushed herself off the bed. As she took the cup he offered, their fingers brushed. His skin was rough and cool, like river stone. A strange jolt went through her, sharp and unexpected. She pulled her hand back quickly. He showed no reaction, turning back to stare out the window at the sodden gray world. "Road will be washed out for a day or two. The creek will be too high to cross." So they were still trapped. The thought should have brought a fresh wave of anxiety, but it didn't. Instead, she felt a strange sense of reprieve. Here, in this cabin, with the door shut and this silent giant keeping watch, the world and its threats felt distant. Over the next 2 days, they existed in a strange domestic truce. The silence between them was still there, but it was less heavy, more companionable. It was punctuated by the mundane sounds of life, the cry of the baby, the sizzle of bacon in a pan, the rhythmic thud of Caleb's axe as he built her woodpile into a fortress against the coming winter. He was a man of ceaseless, purposeful action. He repaired the loose shingles on her roof, reinforced the door on the lean-to, and mended a broken axle on the buckboard. He worked without being asked, seeing a need and meeting it with quiet competence. He never spoke of his past, and he never asked about hers. Ilara, in turn, found a rhythm of her own. She cooked for them, tended to Samuel, and watched Caleb. She saw the way his large, rough hands could be surprisingly gentle when he checked the hoof of her horse. She saw the way his eyes would sometimes linger on Samuel, a deep and profound sadness welling up in their gray depths before he would turn away, his face hardening back into its stony mask. She began to see him not as a threat, but as a puzzle, a man who had deliberately cut himself off from the world, yet had thrown himself back into it to save a stranger. He was a contradiction, a man of immense physical power who demonstrated it only through acts of quiet provision. On the third morning, the sun finally broke through the clouds. The air was crisp and clean. The world seemed washed new. Caleb announced, his voice neutral, "The creek will be passable by midday." The reprieve was over. He would leave. He would ride back to his mountain, and she would be alone again. The thought left a hollow ache in her chest that she did not want to examine. Blackwood was still out there. His humiliation would have festered into a murderous rage. Caleb's intervention had saved her from one fate, but it had likely condemned her to another. She needed to give him something. Not payment, but an answer, an explanation for the trouble he had taken on. While he was outside checking on the horses, she pulled out the old wooden chest where she kept Thomas's papers. She had not been able to bring herself to go through them since his death. Now, a grim resolve settled over her. She needed to understand the true depth of the hole Thomas had dug for them. She sifted through receipts, letters, and deeds, and then she found it. Tucked into the back, hidden beneath a false bottom, was a small, leather-bound ledger. It was not Thomas's handwriting. The script was small, precise, and meticulous. She opened it. The first few pages were lists of supplies, dates, and costs. But as she read on, a chill crept up her spine. It was a detailed accounting of Silas Blackwood's business dealings. But it was more than that. It chronicled bribes to the territorial judge, payments to rustlers to harass smaller ranchers, and inflated invoices designed to bankrupt his neighbors. Then she found the section on her husband's land. The entries were chilling. T. Vance refuses latest offer. Stubborn fool, does not know the value of what he has. A few weeks later, arranged for another loan. His signature is easy to secure. And then the final entry, dated 2 days before Thomas's death. J&M will arrange a riding accident in the ravine tomorrow. The horse is old, easily lamed. A fall is plausible. The debt will be called. The widow will be manageable. The ledger fell from her hands. The air rushed from her lungs. It wasn't an accident. Thomas had been murdered. Blackwood had not just been a predatory lender. He was a killer. He had murdered her husband to get to her land, to get to her. The vow he'd made to her was not just a threat of forced marriage, it was the promise of a conqueror to the spoils of his war. The cabin door opened, and Caleb stepped inside, his shadow falling over her. He saw the ledger on the floor, the look of pure horror on her face. He was at her side in 2 long strides, kneeling in front of her. "What is it?" he asked, his voice low and urgent. She couldn't speak. She could only point a trembling finger at the open book. He picked it up. His eyes scanned the page, his expression unchanging, but she saw a muscle tighten in his jaw, a flicker of something cold and deadly in the depths of his gaze. He read the final, damning entry, and a stillness fell over him. The absolute stillness of a mountain just before an avalanche. He closed the book gently. "I see," he said. The 2 words were heavy with a terrible finality. "He killed him," Alara whispered, the words tearing from her throat. "He killed my husband." The truth, now spoken aloud, was a physical blow. Sobs racked her body, a storm of grief and terror she had held back for months. She expected him to be awkward, to retreat from her raw display of emotion. Instead, Caleb did the one thing she never would have anticipated. He reached out, his large hand settling on her shoulder. His touch was not gentle, not soft. It was solid, unshakable, an anchor of granite in her swirling vortex of despair. He didn't offer empty words of comfort. He just stayed there, his presence a silent vow that she was no longer weathering this storm alone. His touch, firm and grounding, slowly quieted her sobs. She looked up at him, her eyes red and swollen. For the first time, she saw past the hard exterior, past the reclusive mountain man. She saw a man who understood violence, who understood loss. The scar on his face was not just a mark, it was a testament. "This changes nothing," he said, his voice a low rumble, "and it changes everything." She understood. It changed nothing about the fact that Blackwood wanted them both dead. It changed everything because this was no longer about a debt or a piece of land. It was about murder. It was about justice. "What do we do?" she asked, the question hanging between them. It was the first time she had used the word we. Caleb's gaze moved from her face to the ledger in his hand, then to the sleeping form of Samuel in the cradle. His expression hardened, the brief flicker of empathy replaced by a cold, lethal resolve. "We stop running," he said. "We stop waiting for him to come. We end this." Their alliance, forged in the crucible of a shared threat, was now sealed in the certainty of a shared purpose. The relationship was no longer that of protector and protected. They were partners in a war that had just been declared. Caleb did not leave that day. The knowledge in the ledger had tethered him to the cabin, to her, to the coming fight. He spent the afternoon preparing, his movements economical and grim. He cleaned and oiled his rifle, a long-barreled Sharps that looked like it could fell a buffalo at 500 yards. He sharpened his knife until the edge gleamed. He was transforming from a quiet provider into a weapon. Ilara watched him, a cold fear warring with a fierce, newfound resolve. She would not be a weeping victim in this fight. She had been a banker's daughter, then a rancher's wife. Now she would become whatever she needed to be to see this through. "I know how to use a shotgun," she said, her voice clear and steady. "Thomas taught me." Caleb looked up from his work, a flicker of something respect, perhaps, in his eyes. He nodded slowly. "Good, get it." She retrieved the old double-barreled shotgun from its pegs above the door. It was heavy and smelled of rust and disuse. Caleb took it from her, his expert eyes examining the firing mechanism, the barrels. He spent the next hour taking it apart, cleaning every piece with the same meticulous care he'd shown his own weapons, and reassembling it. When he handed it back to her, it felt different, solid, reliable. "Keep it close," he said, "and keep the boy away from the windows." They didn't have to wait long. The attack came 2 nights later. A full moon bathed the valley in a stark silver light, making the world outside the cabin as bright as a ghostly day. It was a fool's moon for an attack, and Caleb knew it. It meant Blackwood was arrogant or desperate. He had been sitting in the chair by the fire, a blanket draped over his shoulders, appearing to doze. But Ilara knew he was as alert as a wolf. She was lying in bed, the shotgun beside her, her ears straining against the night silence. It started with the nervous whinny of her horse from the lean-to. Caleb was on his feet instantly, silent as a shadow. He moved to the window, peering through a tiny gap in the curtain. "3 riders," he whispered, his voice flat, "coming from the east, using the creek bed for cover." Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs. She slid from the bed, grabbing the shotgun. Her hands were slick with sweat, but her mind was icily clear. Samuel stirred in his cradle, and she instinctively went to him, lifting him and holding him tight. "Stay down," Caleb commanded, his voice a low growl, "and keep him quiet." He grabbed his rifle and a box of cartridges. She huddled on the floor behind the heavy, overturned table he had positioned earlier that day, cradling Samuel and trying to soothe his whimpers. The sound of hoofbeats grew louder, then stopped just beyond the clearing. A rough voice called out, "Blackwood wants the woman's stone. Send her out, and we'll let you ride away." It was the voice of a bully. Full of false confidence, Caleb didn't answer. He remained a dark, still shape by the window. Silence descended again, thick with tension. Then came a different sound, the soft scrape of a boot on the porch. The world exploded in a spray of splintered wood as the cabin door burst inward, kicked off its hinges. A large, bearded man stood silhouetted in the doorway, a pistol in his hand. Before he could even register the room, Caleb's rifle cracked. The sound was deafening in the small space. The man in the doorway grunted, a look of profound surprise on his face, and crumpled to the floor. Another man fired from the darkness outside, the bullet tearing through the wall and thudding into the ceiling. Ilara flinched, shielding Samuel with her body. Caleb had already moved, dropping to one knee beside the hearth, the darkest corner of the room. He worked the lever of his sharps, ejecting the spent cartridge and loading a new one. The professionalism of the motion was terrifying. This was a man who had seen battle. The war hadn't just scarred his face, it had forged him. "They'll try the window next," he said, his voice calm, instructional. "When they do—" He didn't need to finish. A dark shape appeared at the window, the barrel of a rifle poking through the broken pane. This was her moment. Ilara rose to a crouch, resting the heavy shotgun on the edge of the table. She took a breath, aimed for the dark shape, and pulled both triggers. The shotgun's roar was a physical blow, slamming her back a step. The window exploded in a shower of glass and wood. A strangled cry came from outside, followed by the heavy thud of a falling body. Silence, a ringing in her ears, the smell of gunpowder and fear. Samuel was wailing now, his cries sharp and terrified. "Reload," Caleb ordered, his voice cutting through her shock. Her hands shook, but she broke open the shotgun, fumbling with the new shells he had laid out for her. She snapped it shut, the click of the mechanism a small, solid sound of defiance. The third man was smarter, or more cowardly. There was a frantic scrambling sound, then the rapid beat of a horse's hooves fading into the night. He was running. Caleb waited a full minute, his rifle trained on the empty doorway, his body coiled like a spring. The silence held. "He's gone," he finally said. He rose and walked to the doorway. Stepping over the body of the man he had shot, he peered into the moonlit yard, his rifle ready. After a moment, he stepped back inside. "They're not coming back. Not tonight." Ilara finally allowed herself to breathe. She sank to the floor, her strength gone, and focused on comforting her crying son. They had done it. They had fought back, and they had won. But the cabin was violated, its door shattered, two dead men lying in her yard. The line had been crossed. This would only end in a grave. Caleb dragged the bodies out into the yard, away from the house. He came back inside and, with a strength that seemed inhuman, lifted the heavy door and wedged it back into its frame, barricading it with the table. He said nothing about her role in the fight, but as he passed her, he placed a hand briefly on her head. It was a gesture of acknowledgement, of partnership. They could not stay there. The cabin was a trap, a tomb waiting to be sealed. They both knew it. "Tomorrow," Caleb said, his back to her as he stared into the fire, "we ride into redemption. We finish this on our ground, not his." Ilara looked at the shotgun in her lap, then at her sleeping son. Her fear was a cold, hard knot in her stomach, but beneath it, something else was growing, a core of iron resolve. She was no longer just a widow. She was a mother protecting her child, and she was a survivor. Silas Blackwood had taken her husband. He would not take her son. He would not take her. The ride to Redemption Gulch was cold and tense. Ilara rode the buckboard, Samuel bundled tightly in a sling against her chest. The leather-bound Leger was wrapped in oilskin and tucked safely beside her. Caleb rode ahead, his big gray stallion eating up the miles, his Sharps rifle resting in the crook of his arm. He was no longer a ghost. He was a reckoning on horseback. They didn't speak. There was nothing left to say. The plan was simple, brutal, and necessary. They would not wait for the law, which was bought and paid for by Blackwood. They would not wait for the townspeople to grow a conscience. They would confront the devil in his own church. As they approached the town, they saw him. Blackwood was standing on the porch of the saloon, surrounded by a half-dozen of his men. The rider who had fled the cabin must have reached him. He was waiting for them. The main street was unnervingly empty. The good people of redemption were behind their curtains, waiting to see who would be left standing when the dust settled. Caleb reined in his horse at the far end of the street, 100 yards from the saloon. He dismounted, his movements deliberate. He turned to Alara. "Stay here, keep the horse ready." "No," she said, her voice firm. She unwrapped the ledger. "This ends with the truth being heard, not just with bullets." A flicker of surprise, then grim acceptance crossed his face. He nodded once. He understood. Her fight was not just his fight, it was her own. He started walking down the center of the street, alone. His long hide coat billowed out behind him, making him seem even larger. He was a figure from a legend, a righteous avenger walking toward a den of snakes. "Stone," Blackwood's voice boomed, full of bluster. "You made a mistake coming here. This is my town." Caleb kept walking, his pace steady, unhurried. The henchmen on the porch shifted nervously, their hands hovering over their guns. They were paid thugs, not soldiers. They were not prepared for a man who walked into gunfire as if it were a mild breeze. "You murdered Thomas Vance," Caleb's voice rolled down the street, deep and carrying. It was not an accusation. It was a statement of judgment. Blackwood laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "You're insane. You have no proof." "That's where you're wrong, Mr. Blackwood." Alara's voice, clear and strong, cut through the tension. She stood up in the buckboard, holding the ledger high for all the hidden eyes to see. "I have your ledger, your confession." A collective gasp seemed to ripple through the town's closed doors. Blackwood's face went from smug to panicked. The ledger. He had forgotten about the ledger. "Lies!" he screamed, his composure shattering. "She's a hysterical woman. Kill him now." The first shot came from a man on the saloon roof. The bullet kicked up dust a foot to Caleb's left. Before the sniper could chamber another round, Caleb's sharps was at his shoulder. He didn't seem to aim. He simply fired. The rifle's boom echoed off the false-fronted buildings. The man on the roof pitched forward and fell into the street with a sickening thud. The rest of Blackwood's men, their courage broken by the display of lethal skill, hesitated. That hesitation cost them. Caleb worked the action on his rifle, firing again, the bullet tearing a chunk of wood from the porch post next to one of the gunmen, who yelped and dove for cover. Chaos erupted. Two of the men started firing wildly, their bullets going nowhere near Caleb, who was now using a water trough for cover. He was not just a brawler. He was a tactician. He had fought this kind of fight before. From the buckboard, Alara began to read, her voice trembling but loud, carried across the street. June 12th. Paid Sheriff Miller $100 to lose the deed claim for the Henderson Ranch. Windows creaked open. Faces appeared. July 3rd, J&M to run off the Miller herd. Brand them double B by morning. More people were stepping into the street now, their fear being replaced by a slow burning anger. These were their neighbors, their friends, whose misfortunes were now being read aloud from the devil's own diary. Blackwood, seeing his power evaporating, seeing the faces of the townspeople turning on him, was consumed by a desperate rage. He drew his own pistol and fired at Caleb, the shot going wide. Then he turned, his eyes wild, and saw the source of his ruin. Ilara. He leveled his pistol at the buckboard, at her son. Caleb saw it. He rose from behind the trough, exposing himself completely. "Blackwood!" he roared. The diversion worked. Blackwood swung his pistol back toward the bigger threat, but in that split second, something happened that no one expected. Mr. Abernathy, the spineless shopkeeper, burst out of the mercantile with a shotgun in his hands. He was followed by two prospectors and another rancher. The town had found its courage. Blackwood was surrounded. His remaining men threw down their guns. His empire had crumbled in the space of 5 minutes. He stood alone, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. He looked at Caleb, then at Ilara, then at the faces of the people he had terrorized for years. He was no longer a baron. He was just a man, a coward. He did the last thing a coward could do. He raised his pistol to his own head, but Caleb was faster. He crossed the remaining distance in a blur of motion, his hand shooting out and grabbing the gun, wrenching it from Blackwood's grasp. He hit him once, a short, brutal punch to the jaw that sent the once powerful man sprawling into the dust, unconscious. Silence fell on Redemption Gulch. The battle was over. Sheriff Miller, his face pale and sweaty, emerged and, seeing the direction the wind was now blowing, dutifully put the cuffs on his former employer. Caleb walked over to the buckboard. He looked at Alara, at the sleeping child against her chest, and at the ledger in her hand. His face was unreadable, but the deadly coldness in his eyes had receded, replaced by a deep, profound weariness. "It's over," he said. She nodded, a single tear tracing a path through the dust on her cheek. "Thank you, Caleb." He simply nodded back, then turned to retrieve his horse. The townspeople were murmuring, gathering around, their voices a low buzz of awe and gratitude, but Caleb Stone paid them no mind. He had done what he came to do. He had restored the balance. The journey back to the cabin was as quiet as the one into town had been, but the silence was different. It was not the tense quiet of impending battle, but the peaceful quiet of its aftermath. The air itself felt lighter. The land, her land, seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. When they arrived, the shattered front door and the dark stains in the yard were a stark reminder of the violence that had visited this place. But they were relics of a finished war. The threat was gone. Caleb spent the rest of the day methodically erasing the signs of the fight. He repaired the door, planing the wood and rehanging it so it was stronger than before. He scrubbed the porch until no trace of what happened there remained. He was not just fixing a cabin, he was reclaiming a home. Alara watched him work, her heart full of a feeling she couldn't name. It was more than gratitude. It was a deep, resonant sense of connection to this silent, solitary man. He had walked out of the wilderness and into her life, a force of nature that had shielded her from the storm and then calmed the winds. That evening, they sat by the fire. Samuel slept peacefully in his cradle. The cabin was warm and secure. The silence between them was no longer a void, but a space filled with unspoken understanding. He had seen the depths of her fear, and she had seen the core of his strength. "You'll be safe now," he said, his voice a low rumble. He was staring into the flames, but she knew he was speaking to her. "Blackwood will hang or rot in a federal prison. The town won't bother you." "And you," she asked softly, "will you go back to your mountain?" The thought of him leaving, of this quiet solidarity vanishing, was a sudden, sharp pain. He was silent for a long time, the only sound the crackle of the fire. He turned his head and looked at her, his gray eyes holding hers. For the first time, she saw no walls, no wilderness in them, just a man, weary and scarred, looking for a place to rest. "My mountain is just a place to be alone," he said slowly. "I've been alone long enough." He paused, his gaze dropping to his own large, scarred hands. "There was a time, before the war, I had a wife, a daughter." The confession hung in the air, a piece of his soul offered up to her. The ancient pain she had glimpsed in his eyes now had a name. "They died of a fever while I was away fighting," he continued, his voice rough with buried grief. "When I came back, there was nothing left, just a piece of empty ground. So I went to the mountains. It seemed like the only place big enough to hold the silence." Alara's heart ached for him, for the man he had been, and for the ghost he had become. She reached out, her hand covering his. His skin was rough, but he didn't pull away. He simply turned his hand over and laced his fingers with hers. His grip was firm, solid, a promise. "This isn't empty ground, Caleb," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "This is a home." He looked around the small, warm cabin, at the sleeping baby, at the woman whose hand was clasped in his. He looked at her as if seeing her for the first time, not as a problem to be solved or a person to be protected, but as a destination, a reason. A faint, rare smile touched the corner of his mouth. It transformed his harsh face, chasing away the shadows. The winter is coming, he said, his voice soft. There's wood to be chopped, a roof that needs checking one more time. He was talking about chores, but they both knew he was talking about a future. He was talking about staying. He squeezed her hand. This land, he said, his gaze moving to the window and the moonlit valley beyond. It's good land, strong enough to build a life on, strong enough to see our children grow. It was not a vow of dominance like Blackwood's had been, but a quiet, earnest pledge of partnership, a promise of a shared future, built not on debt and fear, but on resilience and a hard-won peace. Elara met his gaze, her heart settled and sure, and simply said, yes. In the years that followed, the story of the silent mountain man and the defiant widow became a quiet legend in the valley. The brand on the cattle that grazed the lush land around the spring was not a double B, but a simple, solid S for stone. Caleb and Alara rebuilt the small cabin into a sprawling ranch house, its foundations as solid as the rock of the mountains and the character of the man who built it. The sound of children's laughter, Samuel's and the two daughters that followed, echoed where gunfire and fear once had. Caleb never fully lost the stillness of the high peaks, but the wilderness in his eyes was replaced by a deep, abiding peace. He had come down from his mountain not to conquer, but to connect, and in saving Elara Vance, he had finally found his way home. They had faced down a tyrant and reclaimed not just a piece of land, but their own lives, building a legacy of resilience and love under the wide, forgiving sky of the West.